Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. First up on our list of historical highlights for the week is William Cowper. Cowper was a British poet who penned over 60 hymns, his most famous being There Is a Fountain Filled with Blood. Living in Olney, England, he co-authored a hymn book titled The Olney Hymns with local pastor John Newton. This hymnal is the first place in which Amazing Grace was published. When Cowper grew old, he suffered from dementia and depression. He believed this was God's way of punishing his sins. Cowper died on April 25th, 1800. Next up on our list and the subject of our deep dive is the Minnesota locust plague. A locust plague engulfed the Minnesota farmlands in the late 1870s. On April 9th, 1877, Governor John Sargent Pillsbury called for a statewide day of prayer. Beginning on the night of April 26th, an unusually late cold front brought snow and froze the locust eggs. Several months later, the locusts fled, and local parishioners built a chapel in Cold Spring, Minnesota to commemorate the event. Last up on our list of historical highlights for the week are the religious protests in Poland. On April 27, 1960, as Marxism was on the rise in Poland, police in Nowa Huta were sent to remove a cross from a church construction site. However, many women began to protest, and men soon joined to protect the women from the brutality of the police. Riots began, and these rioters burned the communist headquarters. This was one of many religious protests that eventually forced communist leaders to grant a small measure of religious tolerance to Poland. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Kristi Warne about the Minnesota locust plague.
Hey, we're glad to have Kristi Warne with us to talk about the great grasshopper / locust, as we'll get into it even more, epidemic and the day of prayer, particularly that we know took place in Minnesota on April 26, 1877. And we are really glad to have you join us today, Kristi. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about a passion of mine. So
yeah, well, tell me about that. Well, I'd love to know about how you got interested in it, but first off, tell us kind of real quick of what happened on this particular day of April 26, and then let's dig into a little bit more about your interest in it.
Okay, so we'll have to go back in time a little bit. So April 9th, Governor Pillsbury sent out a message to the whole state of Minnesota to ask for people to pray, fast, and not even work, and ask God to help them, because the plague of the locusts were so bad that if we kept having, did not get the plague with God's help rid of, it would devastate the whole, actually from Canada down to Texas. It was really bad that year. So it was very important that we get rid of the grasshopper. Well, it's not grasshoppers, it's locusts. Anyway, so what he did is he actually decided to ask all faiths to have everybody take that day of prayer and fasting. So what he did also was he must have put it in all the newspapers, because people even from New York City and other places in the country came out to watch. It wasn't necessarily to see that it actually worked, that God was more powerful than man, because they used everything to try to get rid of these grasshoppers. They used tar hopper dozers, they used fire, they used everything to try to get rid of them. And so he declared God is the only one that can get rid of locusts, not us.
So the actual day of prayer was actually issued on the 9th.
That he sent it out early enough so everybody could take that day off and prep and actually pray. And all the denominations could actually take time and ask everybody to
Okay.
give something back to God. Yeah. So after so on the 26th, it was pretty quiet around here. Now in the cities, there were some protests because some of the groups did not believe in God. So they were protesting then that this is not right, that we're asking the whole community to pray. But a miracle happened that night. So with the night of the 26th going into the 27th
Okay.
that morning, there was freezing rain in some areas, actual snow or frost throughout all of Minnesota, is what the newspaper clippings say. And so when that happens, all the eggs died. So all the locust eggs that were in the ground froze somehow. They either got frostbite or they got just frozen from the snow. So that is how it's really helped stop the locust plague. And people just were like, oh my goodness, this actually happened. This is a miracle.
Right.
And we were not the only state that did these things, but we're the one that I think kept the best records of all the days of the day of prayer and why everybody was working together. So I think that's probably why we have a lot of good history in our old books of 1800s.
Wow, about all that to do. So was, from what you know and from your research that you've done and what I recall from our previous conversations is you have spent several years just kind of digging in a little bit more and digging in a little bit more. You got interested and more interested, and you decided, is this thing really a grasshopper? Which is kind of what it's known as, all right, more than anything else is the grasshopper epidemic. But you're saying it's that they weren't. They were really locust.
They were locusts. They were the Rocky Mountain locusts. In the 1700s, it was the first documentation on the California coast of a locust plague. And it was by missionaries. And then the reason it was called Rocky Mountain locust is because every 13 to 17 years, the locusts would come out and have little mini plagues to large plagues. They would come out, eat, and then they would wait and have it happen again. It's kind of like cicadas and all those kind of insects. They don't all come out at every year. They come out at different times. And then also on the East Coast, they also have documentations of the locusts during the 1700s and 1800s. So that's what's really cool. The whole reason I even started, going back to your question, the reason I started doing this is I was asked in 2016 to help take over helping volunteer at the Assumption/Grasshopper Chapel. I'm like, I've lived here so many years and I've never really went there. So I'm like, oh, this sounds interesting. So I researched it and I'm like, wow, this is awesome. And so I kept researching why and who and when. And we had one little great book that was published along like over 40 years ago, but it didn't have a lot of in-depth information. So I just started researching everything. I even went to Europe because they still have plagues over there, and Africa and Asia. There are 10 major types of locusts. The only two places in the whole world that don't have locusts is the United States and Antarctica. So when people say, oh, that's not really a big deal, it's a pretty big deal because they are not here anymore since 1877. Yeah.
They were doggone sure here in the 1870s, right? But they weren't. They hadn't been here since then. So tell us about what you know of Governor Pillsbury. Was he a particularly religious man, or was he just like probably many elected officials of his time? He certainly wasn't professing atheism or anything like that. But was he a regular church-going guy?
Honestly, I never checked that out. That's a very good question. I will have to look into that. I think what happened was he realized that the whole economy was going to suffer, and they used every kind of ingenious invention and man-made thing. One of the cool stories is they had fire pits for the locusts. So the locusts would land. There were so many locusts, they actually put out the fire.
Wow.
They would land on fires and
Like a blanket or
yes,
something to just
that's
land it
how
over there.
many locusts there were. So I think he had to have a knowing God is greater than us, and he's like, okay, we need to get all the church leaders together, and let's try to do something and ask God for help.
Right. Cool. Cool. How about that? How about that? Well, so tell us about the chapel itself. Why this chapel in this spot? If this was a whole, obviously it was a statewide issue, and why did they particularly build this Assumption Chapel? And where is the chapel?
Okay, this is really cool. So I asked that same question. I'm like, why all of a sudden in 1877 did they build this? And I found out in 1855, if you really want to study history again, all the way again from Minnesota all the way down to Texas, there was a major locust plague in the 1855s. And people didn't know what to do. They were starving. And at that point in time, the small group of Germanic, Slovenian immigrants that were in this area actually found this little hill, I call it a hill, and they would go up there and ask God for help. So the whole reason we even know the hill existed was because of 1855 plague.
I got you.
So that's kind of what's kind of cool is it's actually, if you go back in time, that was the last written documentation I could find of why that hill.
Okay.
So then what happened is Father Leo Winter came to become a pastor in this area. And he's like, oh my goodness, you just had a miracle. We need to thank God for this. So he said, he was very much on the pulpit. He stood up and said, you need to use your holy book instead of your pocketbook. He was very upset that the new immigrants were not thankful for what they had. He was very staunch. So he said, okay, let's build a chapel, a place that we can always remember to give thanksgiving to God. So that's kind of how it happened. And so by August 15th, in all my documentation, that's when the chapel actually had its first service.
Okay.
That is when a lot of the documentation said there were no more locusts in Minnesota. So that's kind of the story. Yeah, it's kind of fun. So,
but the chapel is still, you could go see it today, right? I mean, it's
well, we had in my book, I kind of questioned what happened. So after the Civil War and everything, the little chapel, unfortunately, was kind of probably forgotten. There was a lot going on in America at that time. There was a depression. There was just got done with the Civil War. There's all this stuff going on. So in the 1890s, a huge, huge catastrophic tornado, which came from a town that a lot of people from Maine started not too far from the chapel, totally was devastated, and it just went all the way, and they say it's a couple miles wide, and it went from Maine Prairie near us in Cold Spring area where the chapel is, all the way to St. John's, which is near St. Joseph, up to the Mississippi River. And there's devastating stories all over of buildings just being flattened and people losing their lives and things like that. But what's really beautiful about the story is the tornado just picked up the chapel, moved it only a few feet, and put it on some young trees. And so the bell tower and the statues inside, the tables and other things were not harmed. So but the building was. And so some local farmers from St. Nicholas decided, well, we got to take care of this because they did not have a bishop at that time. So who's going to take care of all this? So they took it to their farm so it wouldn't get ruined, because the one statue was made all out of one piece of wood. It's a very pretty, and they didn't want that destroyed at that time. So then what happened is time goes by. World War I, World War II, all this stuff. And then all of a sudden we were going to be celebrating the state of Minnesota, centennials of all different things happening. Okay. And the centennial of Father Piers was coming up. And the bishop in this area is like, we need to really celebrate our ancestors and everything. And he's like, oh, okay. So they decided to build Cold Spring Granite, and a whole bunch of other providers built this out of their own pocket. They never said who it was back then, but and donated all the granite. And we had masons and like the people that did the cement work and things like that. They put in stained glass, they etched beautiful granite, and did that and celebrated in 1952. If you go visit it, it says 1951 was when it was established. Well, there was a huge flood that happened in 1951 and all the granite was partially done, but the inside was not completed until 1952. And then they celebrated it in October was the first church service then. So it's kind of a fun story. So that's kind of, we didn't want to lose our history. And in fact, I'm trying to remember the year because I forgot it again. I should remember. Governor was, it should be 1977, of course, 100 years later. He actually made a huge decree about the grasshopper locust plague and that we should never forget it because it made us who we are.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Kristi Warne on the Center for Christian History website at centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube Music, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Our next episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.